So I'm joined right now by Peter Yates, Stuart Allardyce, and Amy Adams, and we're here today to discuss some of the evidence-based information and the research that they've been involved in. So I'm just going to quickly go around the room here and get you guys to introduce yourselves to the audience. So Amy, because you begin with an A, we're going to start with you.
No worries. I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Birmingham, and my research centres mainly on sibling relationships in the context of sibling sexual abuse and behaviour.
Thank you, Amy. Peter.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Peter Yates, an academic and researcher, really with a specific focus around sibling sexual abuse. That started really when I worked with Stuart, who's on the call also today, when we were both working in practice, working with children and young people who displayed harmful sexual behaviour, or most of the cases that we were involved in at that time involved sibling sexual abuse. So that's really what's kind of prompted my interest, and I've been studying and researching in that area since then.
Great. Thank you, Peter. And Stuart.
Hi there, Nancy. My name's Stuart Allardyce. So I'm a social worker by trade, and I'm currently one of the directors of the child protection charity, the Lucy Faithfull Foundation. I have responsibilities for research across the UK charity, as well as our Stop It Now services in Scotland, and I'm based in Edinburgh in Scotland.
Great, thank you very much. So as I mentioned, in particular, Stuart and Peter, you have been doing a lot of research, published research in this domain, and also Amy and Peter have been involved in some research recently. So Stuart, do you want to kick us off with a bit of background in the research that you and Peter have done and where that has led?
Yeah, I mean, Peter and I have been certainly publishing research and different publications around sibling sexual abuse from about 2010 onwards. More recently, in 2021, we published a report for the Centre of Expertise in Child Sexual Abuse in the UK, which was a kind of evidence and knowledge review for frontline practitioners, basically covering all the basic things that social workers and psychologists and other professionals need to know in working in cases involving sibling sexual abuse. And we did a follow-up from that in 2023, looking at how you implement some of that research in case situations. Peter and Amy have kind of moved on from that and are now doing a kind of systematic review in relation to sibling sexual abuse that Peter and Amy can talk about.
Yes, exactly. And Peter, could we start off just with the for those who don't know, what is a scoping review and what does it involve?
Yeah, so a scoping review is really a review of the literature, just to try to get a sense of where the literature is at, what do we know, what do we don't know, and a broad understanding of that. So rather than looking at particular studies and trying to crunch numbers to kind of say, what does this all find when we put all these studies together, which would be a systematic review, rather than doing something as complicated and sophisticated as that, is more about saying, let's look at the range of research that we have on a particular subject. What does this tell us? Where are the research gaps? What does this tell us in terms of the implications for practice? What further research might need to be undertaken in this kind of area to give us a kind of a broad idea of the scope of literature, hence scoping review on any particular subject. So we've been looking at all of the research literature that's been published internationally since 1980.
Yeah.
So far we've found about 160 publications that have something meaningful to say about sibling sexual abuse across that time period, and within that 160 papers, there are about 90 papers that are specifically focused on sibling sexual abuse, and that's really what we've given most of our attention to in terms of the scoping review and what we've found from it.
Great, and I'm just thinking to myself that since 1980, to have somewhere between sort of 90 and 160 informative papers is indicative of what's been said in podcasts and last year's Awareness Day, and I've heard other people say in different places that really research is lacking across the board. That kind of proves that, doesn't it? In 43 years, we've got 90 to maybe 160 meaningful papers, where in other domains of research and in other areas, you might have that in a year,
Mhm.
you know, that whereas in 43 years we've got, would you agree that it's
Uh,
just shows how much is missing?
Totally agree. Absolutely agree. I wish I had some statistics to be able to quote at you in terms of how many research papers have been done on child sexual abuse more generally, for example, but it would be thousands,
It would,
rather
yeah.
than 90 papers. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it absolutely does indicate the lack of research and knowledge in the area. Yeah.
Yeah, so we still have a lot to learn and a lot to know. But Amy, we do know quite a few things. So based on other papers and the work that Peter and Stuart have done and the scoping review, and what are sort of a handful of things that you would say we know with a degree of certainty that you're comfortable with? Let me put it to you that way. 'Cause with the lack of research, it is difficult to know things. You know, like, but what do we know?
I suppose it'd be helpful to consider the broad themes that we uncovered, and that would sort of tell you the pockets of research that have been undertaken. We see a good amount of evidence around abuse characteristics. There's a fair amount of understanding about that, albeit it's mainly quite descriptive. I would argue we probably don't know too much about prevalence and incidence, but there is some indication. And then we had another theme around family characteristics and disclosure and impact, as well as professional and parental responses. Although that these are patterns and themes, the depth of each theme does vary. And we'll probably speak more to that as we get into each one of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Peter, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Amy's right that it would be good to get maybe into to looking at some of the details of the individual themes. But a sort of a quick answer to that question, I guess, without going into the details, would be I think we can be pretty confident that sibling sexual abuse is very widespread and prevalent. It's very common, but what we can't say is exactly how common. So the studies are not of very good quality of prevalence, and there haven't been any robust studies of prevalence really looking specifically at sibling sexual abuse. The better prevalent studies are the ones that have been looking at child sexual abuse or child abuse much more broadly within which sibling sexual abuse may sit. But in terms of the ways in which they've gone about their questions, it doesn't necessarily give us a terribly accurate impression of quite how widespread sibling sexual abuse is. So the estimates would vary from something like 1% of the population up to about 7% of the population. So that's a pretty broad that's a pretty broad range.
It is.
You know, but even if we were to take that, the 1%, you know, the very lower end of that range, that still tells you that a very significant number of people have been affected by sibling sexual abuse. And that number is only going to increase, of course, when you start to think about that it's not only the children who have been involved specifically in the behavior that have been affected by it, but also other siblings in the family and parents and kind of wider family members. You know, all of these people are affected by sibling sexual abuse as a family issue and as a family problem. So we can say with confidence that it's widespread and it affects a lot of people, but we can't say quite how many people and quite how widespread. I think, yeah.
And I think we're still able to say that, you know, regarding prevalence, that it sort of knows no class, no race of people, no country. I mean, it's a worldwide situation, right? It's not totally impacted by socioeconomics, so that can be an element, but you know what I mean? It's not just a certain group of people that this would impact.
I think that's definitely the case. Yeah, not a certain group of people that would impact. Certainly, very prevalent internationally, like you say, across cultures, across races, across socioeconomic status. And also I think there's probably a bit of a misconception that it's only families in which, you know, there's considerable backgrounds of abuse, you know, within the family, who are probably already involved in some kind of, you know, services because of widespread abuse within the family. And whilst I think it is the case that there is often abuse more widely within the family, or within those families in which sibling sexual abuse takes place. So, physical abuse, domestic abuse, or other kind of forms of child sexual abuse or neglect within those families. That may often be the case. It's certainly by no means always the case. And there are, certainly in the research and from conversations and people that we know through practice, families in which that's not the case, that there's widespread abuse within the family, and yet sibling sexual abuse has taken place within those families. And I think that is one of the questions I think that does come out from the scoping review, is in the absence of widespread abuse within the family, well, why does sibling sexual abuse happen then?
Yeah.
What is the etiology or the pathways to sibling sexual abuse? Why does it happen? When there aren't some sort of more obvious explanations? And I think that's one of the big research questions that does emerge from the review.
Yeah.
Did you find in the review many longitudinal studies on impact or anything over time on any element of sibling? No, Amy, you're shaking your head. No.
No, there's no longitudinal research. It's generally case file and retrospective accounts from
Right.
survivors and professionals. I can't think of a single study that's longitudinal, unless you can, Peter.
That
No, it's a really good question. I'm glad you've asked it, Nancy. Actually, no, I'm not aware of any longitudinal studies either. There's only one study that I can think of that was substantially around talking with children.
Mhm.
The vast majority of the studies are either interviews with adult survivors, surveys, quite often surveys of university students, graduates, or sometimes kind of lecturers and teachers. Interviews with adult survivors, but very, very little in terms of actually speaking with children themselves who've been involved in this, in this experience.
yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, that's very rare, and even the accounts that we do see of children, they're often forensic interviews or clinical interviews. It's not first-hand primary research with children.
I think that's a
Yeah.
really key point, though, isn't it? Because one of the challenges that we have in the literature is that a lot of it comes from case file analysis of quite small samples, which tend to be those cases that have been identified to statutory services like social work and police. It may be the case that we're seeing some of the more serious cases there. It may not be, of course. I mean, but it would be a fairly defendable kind of hypothesis, I think. And I think one of the issues then is that although we may know some stuff about sibling sexual abuse, if we think about sibling sexual behavior on a continuum stretching from kind of normative exploratory behavior that's age appropriate through to behavior that's more inappropriate and problematic. Inappropriate and problematic that in some situations may actually move towards abusive behavior at some point. But actually, we know very little about the stuff that's inappropriate and problematic, simply because the studies that we have more focused on the kind of heavy end cases that have been known to police and social work.
Yeah.
I think that's an important time now to move on to that conversation about what is that spectrum of behaviors, because I know a lot of people, they hear these words, whether those people are professionals working in the domain, families, parents in particular, and society as a whole. I was saying and have said this several times before, that concept of abuse has a pigeonhole in people's heads in society, which includes really always sort of like violent and monsters and these words that can be associated with abuse. But there is in many ways that spectrum of behavior from problematic and inappropriate that does not, for example, and just a warning to the audience that this conversation might get a little bit more explicit, but we're not talking about not all sibling sexual abuse involves rape or penetration or these sorts of things. And I think I want to spend a little bit of time sort of pulling those things apart, and we can give examples of what we're talking about too, because I think we need to have this conversation in society about what these things are in this domain. So can we jump into, because I know Peter and Stuart, you put together, I believe, a spectrum of behavior chart. And can we start to pull that apart a little bit, starting with on the one side, what we would call normative or normal, curious, age appropriate, non-abusive behavior between siblings or like near age cousins or things like that. Can we start there and then move across that spectrum?
Of course. Peter, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same thing. Stuart, would you like to start us off?
I'll jump
Yeah.
in any point you want.
I mean, I think you've said some of it already, Nancy, actually, in fairness, in terms of what we're kind of talking about. But yes, certainly at one end of the spectrum, we would be talking about normal, developmentally appropriate behaviors, typically between young sibling children, that has light-hearted, playful kind of quality to it, where it's about children exploring each other's bodies, maybe exploring gender roles. But yeah, is very much of that kind of light-hearted nature, whereby, if parents were to see, or other adults were to see, this is what these young children were doing with each other. If they were told, this isn't something that you should do. If you want to touch bodies, you do it to yourself and in private. It's not about you touching other people's bodies. Then you would expect that behavior to stop. But is just very much a part of normal childhood kind of exploration. So I think it is really important to stress that there are sexual behaviors that do take place between siblings that are perfectly developmentally appropriate and nothing to worry about, and that we don't fall into the danger of starting to pathologize all sexual behaviors between siblings, which I think would be unfortunate. So that would be at kind of one end of the spectrum. Sorry, Nancy, do come in.
Yeah, thanks. I usually use when I'm sort of saying it on my podcast or whatever, I'm usually saying that the sort of normal-ish behavior would be that you show me yours, I'll show you mine. Ooh, ick, like what is that? Okay, moving on. Just that sort of playful, nondescript kind of stuff. Would that be an example of what we mean by normative, age-appropriate, non-problematic behavior?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Moving across the spectrum.
Yeah, so we talk about maybe inappropriate or problematic behaviors. That I think the boundary between inappropriate and problematic behaviors can sometimes be a little bit difficult to draw without really getting and delving into the details and the context that lies behind the behaviors. And I would say, generally speaking, when trying to differentiate between all of these different forms of behavior, context is really everything. That sometimes only hearing about the behaviors in themselves without understanding the wider context makes it difficult to know quite what the behavior is about. But if we were talking about inappropriate sexual behaviors between siblings, we're probably typically talking about single instances of behavior where there's not necessarily anything wrong with the behavior itself, except for the context in which it takes place. So for the example that we've given in the knowledge and practice overview that Stuart mentioned earlier was, a teenage stepbrother who basically, has basically fairly recently, been moved into a blended family with other kind of step siblings, really fancies his stepsister, and one night when he's a bit drunk sends her a text saying that he really fancies her. So it's inappropriate. It's inappropriate for the context of that family context. It's likely to be uncomfortable at least, and unsettling for the girl who's received that, and something that the parents would want to make sure didn't progress any further and didn't happen again. But if that boy were to send a text message to a girl at school saying, "I really fancy you," we would think, well, that was fine, because that's a girl at school, so that's all right. So that would be behavior that in and of itself is, in a different context, is okay, but as a single instance in this particular context of families is not okay and is inappropriate. Stuart, I don't know if you wanted to come in and say any more about that, but that would be an example of an inappropriate, I think, rather than necessarily a problematic form of behavior.
I mean, we give that example in a publication. The other example that we gave around inappropriate stuff is, an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old sibling who have been involved with some sexual touch of each other's genitals in a bedroom. They're discovered by their mum. They're both very embarrassed. They respond in a very appropriate way. There's nothing to suggest that there's a pattern of behavior. This is something that they've done because it felt nice. So behavior that actually, I mean, the context is really important here as well, but something that's very upstream, something that can be responded to from a preventative point of view. Whereas behavior that's problematic, and as Peter has said, it is quite difficult, I think, sometimes to draw the line between the inappropriate and problematic, and I think probably over time we'll start to lose that distinction, to be honest. But problematic behavior tends to be behavior that's more a pattern, something that has repeated over a number of occasions. So it's starting to lock into something that is more like a behavior that does need to be responded to robustly. The example that we gave in our publication from 2021 was two 13-year-old twins who watch pornography together and they masturbate together. So there's not anything to suggest that there's a power difference in all of this, but it's something that has become a pattern of behavior that they're involved with, which will need some kind of support to help those twins find more appropriate ways of meeting the needs that are met by what they're doing. So we have stuff in this kind of middle category, and then we have stuff that's abusive. I'm going to pass over to Amy. Do you want to jump in on abusive?
Can I just come back first of all? Sorry, Amy, before you jump in on abusive, is that just because you're saying that we might lose this category of problematic, or lose the distinction between inappropriate and problematic, and I'm quite keen that we don't, actually, because I think there are some differences between inappropriate and problematic behaviours. There are some problematic behaviours that are really quite extensive and that would need really quite a robust response. That would be really quite different from behaviours that we would just think of as just merely being inappropriate, but are also clearly not abusive either. And so I think there is a distinct, whilst the boundaries between these two categories are very difficult, at the boundary is very difficult to draw. I still think there are differences between inappropriate and problematic behaviours, and we should be responding differently also.
I think that's fair enough, and there's a controversial issue, I think, in our field, which we probably haven't tackled enough. If you go back to the 1990s, Toni Kavanagh-Johnson in her work talked about children with extensive mutual sexual behaviors, of which she often was referring to siblings. And these tended to be children brought up in fairly neglectful environments, who as young children may have been exposed to sexual things. That may be through the experience of victimization, or maybe witnessing sexual things or seeing things online. And they turn to each other for nurture, for attachment, for connection, which becomes sexualized in some way. But because children's need for nurture and connection is so hardwired, it can often be quite difficult to kind of respond to and shift those kind of behaviors. So Peter's absolutely right, but I think that the controversy is back in the 1990s, Toni Kavanagh-Johnson was certainly talking about this particular category where there's no significant power difference between the siblings. I think maybe we have a more nuanced understanding of power within sibling relationships. It's not to say that those extensive mutual situations don't exist, but I do worry whether sometimes we have classified cases like that in the past where actually there was a power difference, but we just didn't ask the right questions at that time. And I think that's one of the things that we're beginning to learn from, the now growing influence of adult survivor voices in this space.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to mention too, is that more survivors are stepping forward, adult survivors, and want to lend their voice to the research. and make an impact and help researchers who have a breadth and depth of understanding of this topic and the psychology around and all the rest of it, who can help to pull those stories and pull that information apart so that we better understand the whole thing. And I just wanted to mention something here, because I have heard a number of stories myself, and it was mentioned in the 2023 Awareness Day and even podcasts. And I think, Peter, we even touched it on our podcast episode. It's the but the idea that quite often in families where there's a degree of sort of high stress, and the children are suffering in that environment, whether it's a sort of abusive or just stressful, highly stressful, or there's forms of quote unquote dysfunction going on, the children turn to each other, as you say, Stuart, for that mutual comfort and support, and then that becomes sexualized. And so what I'm hearing you say, and I'm just harping on about this because I think that's a more common than we think, that children are doing this from a degree of comfort and mutual support. And I want to identify it. So we would still classify that in that sort of problematic stage, because it is a problem. It's not appropriate as such, but it's not got necessarily that power differential in it, and it's not sort of one person being coerced by another. Would that be fair to say, that that's sort of where it falls into? It doesn't take away necessarily from the negative impacts as children grow up and their frame of mind about what it might have happened, but in the moment, would it be fair to say that that falls into being problematic, even though it's supportive to both children?
That's certainly true. I think that the challenge is we don't know how common those kind of presentations are from the research that's out there at the moment.
Yeah, fair point. Fair point. Amy, do you want to sort of dive into the abusive sort of spectrum of behaviors there, or the behaviors?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment as well on this idea of sort of emotional nurturance. There is patterns. I saw patterns of that in the scoping review, and starting to unpick that, and survivors may say things like, he was my best friend, he was the only person I had, he's the only person I connected to, when they speak about the abuse or the behaviour they experienced. When they give the context where the behaviour occurred, they do often, well, not often, but sometimes refer to the sibling in that way and use terms like, he's my best friend, he's the only person I had, and they'll talk about environments in which parents were possibly emotionally neglectful or abusive, or didn't have the space to offer warmth or love. In terms of abusive behaviours, I think that's probably the hardest category, and the one that we grapple with most, because often the literature speaks to these identifiers, but actually there's a lot of contradictions. And I'm sure Peter can wade in as well on what we've seen in the scoping review. And often it's been predicated on this idea of age gaps and power and maybe gendered dynamics, but actually we see variety in those categories. And just adding to what Peter and Stuart have already said, these are often spoken about without context, and I think that's the area that's missing in terms of abusive behaviours. I'm reluctant to say that XYZ is abusive, because I'm not sure how helpful that is, because I think sometimes that's the issues that we have, is when we label specific behaviours, and there will be specific behaviours that are abusive, but these are the things that we're grappling with. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that where there are some things like, you know, if there's force used, if there's other kind of coercion, manipulation, pressure, persuasion, you know, these kind of things, they would kind of clearly, you know, indicate that the behavior was, you know, was abusive, and you know, significant power differentials between the children would certainly, you know, be a you know, a real cause for concern. So that there are some things that I think make it kind of clear, and I think there are a lot of cases actually when they're presented, for example, to social work, where you would say, well, that's clearly an abusive situation. You, as a 15-year-old and a 3-year-old, you know, there's no doubt about it. But I also think that a lot of the time we also need to look pretty closely at the relationship between the siblings more broadly, beyond the sibling sexual behavior, in order to understand the nature of that sibling sexual behavior. And particularly to understand the power relationship between the siblings in order to understand and make sense of the sibling sexual behavior. So we know, for example, that whilst the majority of abuse takes place between older brothers and younger sisters, there are many examples in the literature and in the research of brothers abusing brothers, sisters abusing brothers, sisters abusing sisters, younger brothers abusing older sisters, younger brothers abusing older brothers, and so on and so forth. So, and given the number of examples of siblings being younger or very close in age, abusing, an older sibling, we really can't be using, I think that's one of the things that's pretty clear from the scoping review that's come out, that we really can't be using age as a defining factor in whether something is abusive or not.
Yeah.
We really need to look in much more detail at the sibling relationship dynamics to make sense of that.
Can I add, and the reason I said that I was reluctant to name specific behaviours is because sometimes we fall into the trap of equating severity with abuse, and that's not necessarily the case. You can have behaviours that are quote unquote not as severe, like penetrative sex, that are still seen as abusive to the person who's experienced them. And I think it's important to highlight that even less severe forms of sexual behaviour can be abusive.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. I was thinking, and I've used it myself when talking about this topic, is that like, and it's an analogy that doesn't fit. I haven't found a better one though in my conversations with people. We know in a workplace, for example, if there is harassment, one person who's harassing another person, generally speaking, there are policies and structures in place in an employment environment where HR would step in and deal with what is perceived as harassment. But the perception of the harassment is more often than not, the person who's been harassed defines whether or not they've been harassed, rather than the person doing the harassing, if you know what I mean. So following on from what you're saying, Amy, somebody may experience behavior that in a document looks like it's, say, problematic, but to them it is abusive. And it needs to be respected that that is the experience that they're having. So they would define it as abuse, whereas somebody else in a professional capacity or out in the bigger world would define it as something else. And I think therein lies, that problem. And we're going to talk in a second about language and the problems that the language associated with SSA can cause, but it's that sort of it's about coming up with the research and the frameworks within which professionals can work and all of these sorts of things, but you're always going to have the lived experience side of it that's going to confound those findings in one way or another and cause entirely different conversations. Would you agree, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of things there. One is would be that professionals are often in the situation where they need to try and make sense of the behavior.
Yeah.
So they need some kind of framework to try and make sense of that behavior. I think it's always worthwhile speaking to the children themselves to see what they make of it. And this hasn't come out in the literature actually, but what I hear is that children are very rarely asked, what did you make of that? And I think if children themselves are clear that either they feel that they've been abused or traumatized or really upset by their behavior, then we should be taking that really seriously. What we understand, however, is that children as children very often find it very difficult to make sense of the behavior, very difficult to understand the impact that behavior has had on them. The impact of the behavior isn't always evident during childhood, but often comes out during adulthood. So just because a child doesn't say or demonstrate in some way that the behavior was harmful or abusive doesn't mean that it wasn't harmful or abusive. And I think it's then up to professionals to be able to make that judgment based on the kinds of criteria and deep thinking and assessment that we've been speaking about. However, I think when we're talking with adults and adult survivors, if they are in hindsight saying, actually, you know what, looking back at that behavior, I was abused, then I think we should be taking that very, very seriously. And it would only be respectful to accept that interpretation of the behavior that's taken place.
Yeah, that it kind of speaks to the Hardy study, in which they asked people how they viewed the behaviour at the time. This is adults retrospectively. And then they said at the time they didn't, some more survivors said that they felt that the behaviour was abusive in adulthood, but not at the time that it occurred. And I think people's perceptions change with development and when they've processed what's happened.
I think that's important to reinforce too, because parents who may be listening to this conversation will, you know, talk to their kids or whatever, and the kids may seem quote unquote fine, and they may not define something as abusive, but in actual fact, you know, it may have those longer term impacts. So it's not just something to be pushed off to the side. And like most things, I think that frameworks and all of these models are exactly that. They're guides, and they guide people in their decision making, and they guide people in their understanding. But it's really about the people involved, both the children involved and the wider family. And I think that goes back to what we were saying about it's the framework is really important, specifically in relation to SSA. There have been other frameworks in terms of peer-to-peer abuse and other things as well, but now there's more of this framework that's related to SSA, and that's a super grounding thing to have. But as you were saying, the context of everything is really important, and it isn't just about having, you know, a box that we can put something in and a single conversation that we can have with people. It's about where is this happening, why is this happening, you know, and involving the different perspectives based on a framework and based on the people involved. And I think that's where the framework though comes into play, is helping people, guiding people, particularly survivors, because I know survivors have been sort of saying, was this abuse, was this problematic, you know, and so they've been looking for something, and now they have something a little bit more defined, which is a guide for them, but still their own opinion about what happened is super important. As perhaps they go into it, maybe into a therapeutic environment, or they give it more consideration, particularly as adults than as children. And I've heard lots of people say exactly what you said, Amy. As a kid, they thought it was normal. They thought all their friends were doing this with their siblings. You know, they didn't have any negative feelings towards it necessarily, but it's only as they got older, particularly if they hit puberty or in their late teens, and then it's all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, this really bad thing has happened to me. So the conversation changes over time, where other forms of abuse, you know, it's black and white. I mean, adult to child abuse, black and white. We don't have confusion over that. So, you know, as a framework goes. So,
And
mhm.
language is so important and key here, isn't it? Because we clearly, you know, we want a, you know, contextual, nuanced, developmentally orientated understanding of sibling sexual behaviors. And, you know, if we use the wrong language to describe particular behaviors, then that can lead to net widening. It can lead to decision making that really, you know, harms children involved, and indeed families as well. I'm just thinking here, I mean, just to give you an illustration, I had a chat with a social worker a few years ago, who had said to me that she was working with two siblings. I think they were kind of age 6 and 8. They'd been brought up in a very abusive environment. Both children had been sexually abused by adults. They had also displayed sexualized behaviors towards each other, which the social worker described as sibling sexual abuse. So interesting that, you know, children who are very reactive to their own experiences are being described as perpetrating or causing sibling sexual abuse. And what really struck me then was the social worker saying, and of course, these children will never live together as siblings ever again because of what's gone on with respect to this sibling sexual interactions that have happened. It's like, gosh, you know, that's a big jump here. And I wonder whether one of the things going on there is that if you label things as sibling sexual abuse, then there's a whole set of assumptions that flow from that, rather than us thinking about things as sibling sexual behavior, some of which might be abusive. And indeed, if you look at the publication that Pete and I did in 2021, the word sibling sexual abuse was in that title. When we came back and looked at the subject again in 2023, we tried deliberately to change the wording of the publication we produced as being about sibling sexual behavior, to try and avoid, you know, if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you conceptualize everything in terms of sibling sexual interactions as being sibling sexual abuse, then you will always respond to these things in a particular manner, I think.
Yeah, I wonder how that looks though on looking at it from the other side, in that if we run the risk of not recognising abusive behaviours and then being categorised as just behaviour when they are abuse. And I wonder how that looks if the term sibling sexual behaviour becomes the term that's adopted.
I can tell you.
by organisations, you know, therapeutic organisations,
Yes.
help seeking behaviours. How does that look for adults and children who are looking out for help for abuse? Calling it. These are the things we continuously grapple with, and I don't think there's a right answer, but there's a lot of nuance to the answer.
I think there are some wrong answers.
Yeah.
And I think that there are different terms that we need to use precisely for particular reasons in particular contexts. So I would completely agree with Stuart that the field that we're in, but when I say we, I'm thinking particularly professionals. So if we're thinking of social workers or other professionals who are presented with sexual behaviors that have gone on between siblings, and they need to make sense of those behaviors and figure out, well, where do these behaviors lie on this spectrum that we were just talking about? Is this normal and appropriate, or is this something that's more problematic, or is it abusive, or whatever it is? Then those professionals are in the field of sibling sexual behaviors, and needing to make sense of those sibling sexual behaviors and what you know, what they're actually dealing with. I also think that many children and adults really find it difficult to make sense of the behaviors that they've experienced, and are very confused about where responsibility lies for those behaviors, and would tend to think, this is probably going to get onto a bit of a conversation we were going to have later on, but would tend to think, well, child sexual abuse is when an adult sexually abuses a child. And I wasn't sexually abused by an adult. I was doing sexual things with my brother or sister. This service says that it's about child sexual abuse, so that's clearly not for me. Or this service says it's about sibling sexual abuse, and I'm not really sure if it was abuse, because I'm not really kind of sure quite what was going on there, and have struggled to make sense of it. So I would think that sometimes when services are trying to be inclusive and trying to show that they are relevant for people, that they might want to give a bit of a menu. You know, we are here to support people who have been involved in doing sexual things with their siblings that's left them troubled, upset, you know, hurt, harmed in some way, and those children who have experienced sibling sexual abuse. So that anybody reading that who has done sexual things with their sibling will think, well, that's for me. I could benefit from that service. Whereas I think if we only label it as abuse, or certainly if we only label it as child sexual abuse, then I think we might be excluding people from a service that they could actually benefit from. On the other hand, I'm totally in agreement with you, Amy, on this one, is that if we just start to call all of this behavior sibling sexual behavior, or as I think some people are proposing, sibling sexual dynamics, and we stop talking about sibling sexual abuse, then we're really minimizing the very serious nature of the behavior, the impact that has on people who are affected by it. And I think that's going to then do people quite a considerable disservice. So I think when we're clear about that, we're talking about sibling sexual abuse, personally, I think we should be using that term and being quite strong and robust in advocating for that term to be used when it's appropriate.
Sorry, Amy, can I come back to you just before I lose my thought, which will likely happen? I know in the circles that I run, as an adult survivor myself, the adult survivors are pretty clear on most of this stuff, in that as soon as they begin to understand that what happened was not normal, they'll begin to parse out the relationship between the sibling. And to me and to many of my peers in the various groups and stuff that I belong to, the term sibling sexual behavior sniffs of equity between the players, as it were, that I was an equal participant in what was going on.
Yeah.
In my own experience, I personally think of the spectrum of behaviors related to sibling sexual abuse, and I call it all abuse myself personally, except for the normative stuff, is more of a bell curve, where on the far right-hand side, we're talking about very clear, abusive, violent, rape type situations, all of these this is in my head. And then on the far right-hand side, we're back to that sort of inappropriate siblings watching porn together, or an older sibling encouraging a much younger sibling, say, to watch porn. That's on the far left-hand side of the bell curve. In the middle, in the people that I've spoken to and the experiences that they've had and the stories that I've collected, is this big bell curve of behaviors, of things that have occurred to the sibling by another sibling that relate to maybe digital penetration, but not rape, not intercourse sort of thing, or groping and fondling and degrees of coercion and manipulation and don't tell anybody and all that sort of stuff. And that's where most of the people that I've ever spoken to in terms of what's happened in their world fits in there. They would classify most of the behavior as abusive rather than abuse, but it's abusive to them. And they want to avoid anything that sniffs of equity. So sibling sexual behavior means that I was equally involved. And also the notion of, what's the other term, that it's something that happens between siblings. No, it doesn't. There's one sibling who's causing it to happen over another one, even if that is for a degree of nurturance and comfort. Somebody, even in a microsecond, makes some sort of step that moves something that is nurturing and comforting into a sexualized behavior. Granted, I personally don't see that as being on the right-hand side of that bell curve of mine. But you see what I mean? Anything for survivors that sniffs of equity when the behavior to them has been abusive. Not so much abuse, but just abusive. And I think that just little change in the narrative there does make a difference for many adult survivors when they're trying to make sense of what happened to them. It was abusive behavior. Was it abuse in my head, the way that I think of, sexual abuse in the workplace, or child sexual abuse, adult to child? No, not at all. But it was abusive.
Yeah.
So that change of narrative, I think, does make a difference to people. I'm just sort of sharing conversations I've had with folks.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I would probably, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's a few things I would say, Nancy. Sorry, that makes a lot of sense, and I would that very helpful actually, and very helpful to get that nuance between sibling sexual abuse and abusive behaviour, and that distinction of that language. I think that's useful. I would completely support the idea that we need to, when we are talking about abuse or abusive behavior, that we don't use language that in any way, as you say, gives a sniff of equity, because I think that's extremely unhelpful. So I would go along with that. Where we might slightly diverge is partly some of your examples of what would constitute something on the left of the spectrum or the right. I think, when you talked about the one that was appropriate, I was kind of thinking, that doesn't sound very good to me. So we would have a debate about whether that was actually okay or not, because we might disagree about whether that was okay or not. I also am slightly wary or cautious, I think, about what, while we have the spectrum of behaviors from normal through to inappropriate, problematic, and abusive. I know you don't go along with the inappropriate, problematic necessarily, but we're broadly talking about that spectrum of behaviors. I would be very reluctant, I think, to have a spectrum of abusive behaviors. Because that tends to kind of suggest that we've got, it was abusive, but it wasn't that bad. Or it was abusive and it was really bad. And it suggests that the seriousness of the behavior or the impact of that behavior is really determined by the nature of the behavior rather than a whole host of other factors,
Yeah.
such as, the family context, the sense that that child or that adult has made of the behavior, the beliefs that they've been left with around, relationships and their views of themselves and so on and so forth. I think there's a whole load of factors that determine how seriously and significantly somebody is impacted beyond
Yep.
what the actual behavior was. So I'd be reluctant to go down the road of having a kind of a spectrum of abusive behaviors as if we have somehow less serious to more serious abuse, because I think that's a tricky road to go down.
I totally agree. Like the bell curve I hold in my mind goes from sort of what you would say is inappropriate behavior through to abusive behavior.
Yeah.
But the impact box that I lay over it is equal.
Yeah.
So I have spoken to people who were repeatedly exposed to pornographic material by their older sibling, and they now have some of the same sort of in their adulthood have some of the same sort of impacts that we see with others who are elsewhere on that bell curve of what's occurred. So to me, impacts are equal across the board for the most part. I mean, individual differences and stuff like that, but it's just I agree. I don't think it's even possible to have sort of categories of things, but I think it is wise, and I think what's happening is in terms of all of this is when we can sort of remove the big brush that society currently has, that the word abuse is always about monsters, it's always about intercourse. Like I even had somebody say to me, I thought sibling sexual abuse always involved intercourse. So that's because the word abuse is there, and that's the pigeonhole that is created in society right now from the past use of sexual abuse, right?
I think that would speak to, if I'm coming in from like a gendered lens, in that sexual abuse always occurs between a male to a female as well, and this perception we hold broadly around sexual violence, that it involves penetrative rape, and I think that's an issue that we have broadly as well around our perceptions of sexual abuse.
It's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing about the language piece is I think it's really important that we, as you were saying, Peter, it's so tricky to find language in many different subjects that accurately reflects something, particularly when people have their own subjective experience. So to try and put objective language onto it is, putting objective language onto a subjective situation is one thing when you have cold, hard facts, H2O equals water. That's, we can clearly label that, we can clearly say something about that. But you have looking into a situation, you have these objective eyeballs looking into a situation, and you have the subjective experience of those involved in it. And when you put those two things together, I think it's really hard that, we're ever going to come up with a dictionary that relates to sibling sexual abuse or behavior or trauma, or, I don't think we're ever going to have a dictionary, which just makes it a little harder for people to understand things, but it's worth trying to look for that language, I think.
I think it's important as well to say at this point that even when we are talking around sibling sexual behaviour, if a survivor themselves defines it as abuse, then we're not trying to say that, no, this should be labelled as behaviour. If that's what the survivor believes it to be, and it that's their experience, then absolutely you should call that abuse.
I would agree with you, absolutely 100%, and Amy. And I think the situation is even more complex than what you're describing, Nancy, because if you're a social worker and you're involved with a case where there has been sexual interactions between siblings, and as Peter has said, one of the things that a social worker, as a kind of first responder, will need to do is think about, okay, what is the level of seriousness here? What language do we use to apply to this particular situation, which will then help us think about what level of assessment and intervention is needed in response to it. Clearly, any good social worker will be getting the views of all the people involved, all different family members and all of the children. But as Peter has said, the child who has potentially been harmed in all of this may lack the developmental awareness to realize that what has happened to them is harmful. So although it's incredibly important to pay attention to subjective experience, the social worker also needs to think about what might be the subjective experience of this person 10, 20 years from now.
Yep.
Which is why I think that the only way this can be done in an ethical way is making sure that social workers know and understand some of the research that flows from interviewing adult survivors in all of this, so that they're taking that into account in looking at a situation like this, actually.
And I think too that taking that out a little bit further, yes, absolutely. And also for parents to know the research, for parents to understand this discussion, for example, this whole discussion that we're having, for society generally to know, because society has an impact on prevention and intervention as it relates to SSA, based on whether or not, they, for want of a better phrase, whether or not they care, whether or not there's going to be funding that's made available for additional research, or programs and supports that are put in place for intervention. When society cares about a subject, that usually creates political will and changes in various policies and preventative steps being put in place and all of these sorts of things. So I think the very discussion that we're having right now is not only particularly important to social workers and those and professionals, and the research and everything is really important to support those people, but also for parents in particular, who are the gatekeeper between the family and the systems that they might need support from. The parents are the gatekeeper, so they make decisions based on what they feel they know, all sorts of other things too, but you know what I mean, what they feel they know, but also society. So the more people who learn about and understand this entire conversation, I think the better over the longer term, not only in terms of prevention, but intervention as well, where SSA has already occurred.
Another facet to this is so complicated, the subject, but just in terms of language, is that, I mean, this research is a little bit old now. It's going back to 2008, but there was a few bits of research around that sort of time that said that, I mean, there's a whole load of issues about disclosure that we could get into, but one among very many challenges to children being able to disclose, or tell other people about what's happened to them, is that they just didn't have the language available to do that. And that all of the language that certainly at that time, that was available, just didn't fit for people, didn't fit for children, and they therefore didn't have any way of expressing their experiences. So I think that does remain some, as a piece of research, I think that does need to be undertaken. Currently, if we're going to be supporting children to be able to tell people about what's happened to them, what's the language that would fit for them, that would give them some terminology in order to be able to express that. Certainly back when the research was undertaken, when it was presumably words like child sexual abuse and things like that, that just didn't fit for these children, that they couldn't use that language.
When I was growing up, the only term that was ever used was incest. And
Mm.
that's all I ever heard. And I didn't recognize myself in that conversation at all. And it wasn't until much later in my life that the whole conversation about sibling sexual abuse, or sibling sexual behavior, sibling sexual interaction came to the fore. And it was really, for me, like 20 years ago, maybe, so yeah, finding language that is appropriate for everybody to be able to identify themselves in this conversation, I think is super important. That sort of leads me on to, you've done the scoping review. We've indicated that there's just this huge gap in research, and there's much that we need to learn, even though there's a lot of stuff that in the research. But what are some of the key research questions that still exist, do you think?
There's going to be a load of them. There's lots of them. I think we need to know a lot of the research is around brother-sister abuse. That's where most of the research lies, in all areas really. And so I think there is a lot to be done to understand the nature of brother abuse, sister abuse, sister abuse. All of the indications are at the moment that they're all equally kind of harmful, you know, there's no hierarchy of if you're abused by your sister, it's not as bad, or any of that kind of stuff. All the indications are that they're all equally harmful, but there may be some nuances around some of the dynamics or the particular impacts that we don't understand, or the pathways to those behaviors that we don't yet understand. So I think there's an awful lot to explore about different the different kind of sexes of the children that are involved, and also where there are more than two siblings that are involved. Again, most of the research is about two children being involved, but we know that sometimes there are more than two children in a family that are involved in this kind of behavior. So I think there's a whole load of questions around that. Most of the research is of kind of white Western cultures. So there's a lot more that needs to be found out about sibling sexual abuse within other cultures, other kind of contexts. As we were talking about earlier, we need to know a lot more about the prevalence to really understand the scale and nature of the problem, so that we can therefore bring appropriate resources to be able to support families who are affected by this issue. We know quite a lot about some of the characteristics of many of the families who are affected by sibling sexual abuse. We don't understand yet quite why and how some children get involved in abusive sibling sexual behavior in the absence of some of those more typical and obvious family backgrounds of high levels of stress and abuse within those families. We also don't necessarily know a lot about, whilst we might know some of those characteristics, we don't really understand what are the dynamics within that family, what are the communication patterns within that family.
Yeah, often the information we have is quite descriptive, often from case file analysis and interviews with adults, which obviously is helpful, but we don't have, there's not research where it speaks to each family member. There's not primary qualitative research with family members. The only study I can think of is the welfare study that seeks to do that, and welfare herself speaks about the difficulties of recruiting a whole family and understanding the dynamics and characteristics that sit within a family unit. Often we just have information that might say something like parental substance misuse 20%. It gives you that sort of level of detail, not the intimate lives that families have where sexual abuse or behaviours occurred.
Yeah, there's a lot of context that's missing in the research to date.
A lot.
I mean, one of the things for me is that the literature in relation to adults who have been affected by this issue quite rightly focuses on those who are adult survivors of sibling sexual abuse. I'm also quite interested in what happens to those who have caused the harm. And what happens to them longitudinally over the life course. And you mentioned early on, Nancy, that we've got quite a lot of studies that have looked at reoffending rates of young people who display harmful sexual behavior. We don't really know anything much about the sibling sexual abuse cohort within that. But actually, I'm just as interested in, the emotional and well-being and psychological impact of causing harm to another sibling over the years, and indeed what that means for those siblings who have caused harm when they get into relationships themselves. And certainly, from our helpline in the UK at Stop It Now, we've had several phone calls from those who have caused harm to siblings in childhood who are now phoning as adults, who seem to have really significant psychological issues that flow from what they have, for want of a better term, perpetrated.
Mm-hmm. And the story portal at SiblingsToo.com, I have a number of stories from adults who caused harm with and without being harmed themselves. And now I'm thinking of one in particular where the story from that person demonstrates more care and concern for the harm that they caused instead of the harm that was caused to them, if you know what I mean. Now, as adults, the person writes about relationship problems, alcohol problems, and all of these sorts of things that they themselves are drawing back to the behavior that they imposed upon their sibling. Of course, there might be other things like they were abused themselves or whatever, but I agree. I think those who cause harm need to be a part of the conversation, this particular one, in terms of sibling sexual abuse, for everybody to more fully understand it, because we are still talking, generally speaking, about children. Children who behave in a way that causes harm to another child. And again, from you guys have heard all the stories too, where people, adults would say, you know, I never wanted my brother or sister to be removed from the home. I just wanted the behavior to stop. And I wanted it to be acknowledged that I had been hurt. And that's what they were looking for, right? So it, to me, that's sort of indicative of, you know, there's an appreciation by the sibling that's been harmed, particularly if it's not been sort of violent rape type harm, but that you know, they recognize that this is also a child, a fellow child who's caused this behavior. And to just label everybody as some sort of monster and, you know, predator and all the rest of it, I think is totally inappropriate for the most part in sibling sexual abuse. So I agree with you, Stuart, that one of the things that's missing from the conversation is the again, for want of a better phrase, the perpetrator's voice.
Yeah, I wish we could speak to that empirically, because we can't really know in an adult context. We have a lot of victim survivor adult voices, but certainly I can't think of any research that seems to understand. We often understand children's experiences at the time, again through case sort of analysis and forensic and clinical interviews and those kinds of things, but not the primary research with children who harm is completely lacking.
What do you think needs to happen in order for those who have caused harm to be willing to speak? I mean, I know it's only recently that survivors are now stepping forward, but they are stepping forward, you know, with great speed and desire to be a part of some sort of solution, or, you know, preventative strategies and things like that, being a part of research and being a part of getting their story out. What needs to happen for that person who causes harm to feel safe enough to do that?
Well, I guess as well, there is another issue at play, and it's more of a pragmatic academic issue in terms of ethics and seeking out children who have harmed as children, but speaking to them as adults and our perception of what we have of this population. Ethics often see them as a risk and a difficulty to speak to these people. It's harder to get ethical approval on. I've faced that myself in my own PhD research. It's something I wanted to do, but I was facing all these ethical dilemmas in disclosures and how to respond to disclosures and all the real research challenges. And I think the knowledge that we have on sibling sexual abuse and behaviour sometimes actually speaks to the availability of information, of the availability to gain case files, and victim survivors' willingness and more of an ease ethically in terms of research to speak to that population. I think it's not always necessarily people coming forward. Sometimes it is more of a pragmatic issue as well.
Interesting. It's, I hope that a path can be found so that can be, that conversation can be had in an academic context. I also hope that it can happen in a non-academic context, even sort of like, you know, and like I collect the stories, and it's just people being able to share their story and anonymously. And I know there's a lot more anonymous research, qualitative research that's done through sort of online portals and things like that. Maybe that's sort of step one until something can happen more academically and pass ethics.
I think that's right. I mean,
sorry, go on, Stuart. Sorry.
I was just very quickly. I mean, I think there's maybe more that we can do in the space, because I mean, certainly, you know, Stop It Now in the UK, also in the US, also in Australia. I mean, we provide anonymous and confidential supports to people who are affected by sexual abuse, including those who have caused harm. And indeed, we often have quite lengthy conversations with individuals who have been involved with offending behavior, who have not been arrested, but are looking for advice and support about how they move away from offending behavior. And I don't think we've done any work within that, looking at the experiences of those that have been involved with sibling sexual abuse or behavior. In fact, many of the people who contact our services, certainly in the UK, have been involved with online offending behavior feel they're in some kind of addictive loop about what they're doing online and are just looking for any kind of support to stop before they get arrested. And I think these are people genuinely seeking out self-help. But that stuff about self-help spaces and sibling sexual abuse, I think, is underdeveloped, and we need to explore more.
Yeah.
So I want to sort of summarize some of the things that we've talked about, and I know we could talk at length about and dive deeper into some of these things, and hence probably another awareness day next year. But like a couple of things that we talked about that repeated were the idea of understanding what's occurring within the family must take into consideration context. And you don't just yank out two little kids and try and figure out what's going on, but there's a whole context and sort of past that shows up in that behavior somewhere. And yes, I'm on the right track with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing is that there's problems with the idea of having a spectrum of behavior, yet at the same time, it is important for people to understand not only and parents in society to understand in particular, the sort of normal behavior, the more innocuous, you show me yours, I'll show you mine, haha, ick, what's that, and just general curiosity, lighthearted, as you were saying, Peter. And then we move into other behaviors that are within the context, likely inappropriate, likely something that is problematic. And when I think of the term problematic, I have to say, I think in my head, it means that there is a problem that exists and it's causing a problem. When I think of the word problematic, that's how I sort of define it in my head. And then sort of moreover into the more abusive behavior. And all of those need to be looked at by those who understand from a distance, preferably, sort of the framework and are able to, as we were sort of saying, speak to other people, put it in what we know in the research about the different situations where the behavior can occur. It's not necessarily those types of behaviors you were sort of saying, similarly aged children encouraging each other to masturbate with pornography, that leans into that inappropriate, problematic type thing. That these sorts of things must be understood, so they're not just necessarily poo-pooed under the carpet. They can be looked at and still be deemed to be, okay, this isn't necessarily going to have a longer term impact, and this is how we deal with it now. But it's not just something that we would call normal behavior. That's not normal behavior. That's not the normative behavior you guys were talking about. And so all of these behaviors outside of normative behavior should really be looked at. So that's what I heard you saying. Am I correct in that? Should be looked at some level.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then we also sort of talked about some of the problems that exist around the language, the whole language thing, which I think has been going on for a while now and will continue to go on for a while because it is both objective and subjective. There's no hard and fast dictionary that goes along with it, and it can be quite confusing.
I think there's a real need for much better sex education within schools that addresses the issue that sometimes children cause harm to other children through their sexual behaviors, and sometimes those children that are involved are brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
I think we need to be using very straightforward language in talking about that to help children in those education sessions to be able to put the pieces together and think, oh, hang on a minute, that's what's happening to me. And you're telling me that shouldn't be happening. Or that children are able to say, hang on, that's what I'm doing to my brother or sister. And now you're telling me that I shouldn't be doing that. And that they're given a language and a terminology with which they can then express that. So I think that would be really important that the education is out there for children so that children can understand that and be given a language in which they can talk about it. Parents obviously also need that kind of education and language so that they can, first of all, kind of look out for concerns about their children, but also respond more appropriately if children are trying to tell them things about things that have happened to them with their brothers and sisters. Amy, sorry, you've been trying to say something for a while.
I think I discussed it in our previous chat, Nancy, that we do need to get realistic that not all sibling relationships are wonderful and glorious and founded upon love and sunshine. Like things can go wrong and abuse can occur.
Just to
One of
add
The other
one, can I just add one thing, which is you know, Peter and I published a book around adolescent harmful sexual behavior or children's harmful sexual behavior a few years back, and there's a chapter in it about children's sexual behavior. When we were kind of looking at the literature on children's sexual behavior, there's a really fascinating Scandinavian article which talks about a kindergarten response to two 5-year-old children sexually interacting while playing, and in that particular situation there was enough for the people in charge of the kindergarten to bring in the parents to say, look, we need to inform you that this has happened, and you know, we're not dealing it as a child protection matter, but we wanted you guys to kind of know that this has happened so you can kind of keep an eye on this kind of stuff in the future, because we'll be doing that here. And the response of both parents was, well, both sets of parents was, okay, who was the victim and who was the perpetrator? It's that binary way of thinking, which I think is the difficulty that we bring to this, and which often then smothers any complexity. As Peter and Amy have said, when abuse is abuse, it needs to be absolutely labelled as such. But we're often, you know, describing complex situations, which is why one of the things I take away from this discussion, and I'll be stealing this, Nancy, I think your idea of trying to move away from talking about abuse, but talking about abusive behavior, thinking about this as an adjective rather than a noun, is actually quite a nice way of beginning to think about impact rather than reifying things as simply whether they're abuse or not.
Well,
I really
steal
like
away, steal away. That's fine.
I really like that as well, and I think the other thing that I was thinking of there that leads very well from what you were saying, Stuart, in terms of that the way that we talk about these binaries of a victim and a perpetrator, is that all of our systems are geared up around those binaries as well.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that might help children to come forward and adults to come forward is if we had a set of different responses to this situation. So what we understand from many children and adult survivors is that they want justice for the harm that they've experienced, but that isn't necessarily a legal justice. It doesn't involve going to court and having somebody punished or sent to prison. It's about having the harm that they've experienced acknowledged and recognized, and for accountability to be appropriately placed with the child who instigated, caused, whatever that would be the appropriate verb, you know, that harm or instigated that abusive behavior. So rather than labeling one child as the abuser, you know, as the perpetrator, and one child as the victim, let's say here are these children who were involved in this behavior. One of them has instigated the abusive behavior. The other one's been harmed by that abusive behavior. Is there a more, and this has affected that sibling relationship, it's affected the family relationship, it's caused a lot of disruption within those kind of family systems. Is there a more restorative approach that we could take in terms of repairing those relationships and providing justice in that kind of way rather than a punitive kind of legalistic kind of response? I mean, there may be circumstances in which a legal response is absolutely appropriate and necessary. So certainly I'm not going to discount that in any way, but I think if we had a repertoire or a menu of responses that was more repairing of relationships and repairing of harm, I think that might also help to for people to come forward about this behavior and to bring a more appropriate response to it as well.
And I think that's where it'd be helpful to quickly mention as well, this idea of victim perpetrators is not always clean cut either. Children who cause harm can have experienced very severe victimization themselves in many forms. The literature is quite clear on that often children who have harmed have some form of history of abuse or neglect or along those lines.
And it's in this year's Awareness Day, I have a content block that is specifically dealing with the concepts of restorative justice and restorative practice. And also in terms of interventions, the concepts around resilience and post-traumatic growth. I'm also having conversations around the obstacles and opportunities available to change or tweak sex education, and also looking at the use of language and how it impacts societal stigma. So sort of diving into that a little bit more, because I think that's an important thing as well, this whole concept of language, and how it makes people react and respond to things from the narrative psychology point of view, because I think that's important. So yeah, and one thing you were just saying, Peter, and I know it isn't cut and dry like this, is when there is a repertoire of supports or interventions or any of these sorts of things, if you then also have that sort of framework, we've already agreed that the impacts of any sort of non-normative behavior can be the same across the board. You know, the impacts have been shown: anxiety, PTSD, suicidal ideations, all of these sorts of things, sort of across, one would say, is the spectrum. But I think it's also, in my mind, if you have a variety of things that you can sort of pull on to support people, and not just the only that criminal justice system, that's really useful. And for me, and one of the other content blocks is with Dale Tolliday and Russ Pratt again in Australia, and the work in Australia that is providing supports that are public health centered rather than criminal justice, and how that's changed things in Australia. And I think that's again something that we really, I know for myself, I really want to advocate for that change of perspective from a criminal issue, which is always associated with that term sexual abuse. You know, it's somebody's sexually abused somebody else, so therefore they must go to jail, is usually how society thinks of it, rather than this is maybe a combination of various health issues in terms of brain development, mental health situations, use of sexualized behavior as a coping strategy for high levels of stress, like we talked about before, all of these sorts of things. And I think as these conversations develop over time, I think it will be that much easier maybe to see that range of supports that can be, you know, made available and put in place for those who have been, for entire families who've been impacted by SSA. That's just my sort of wish for the future, as it were, particularly, you know, from the perspective as an adult survivor. That's what I would like to see happen, you know, is because it would have made my life a lot easier 40 years ago when you know, I was starting to deal with this. If the language was there, if I had a place that I could have dialogue, if there was a place that I could explore what had happened to me, and not necessarily, you know, either, what's the term, overreact, underreact, whatever, you know, but be appropriate in my own response, and have, you know, I believe very firmly that the broader my dictionary, the more I am able to communicate my real feelings, my real experience. But when I don't have the language, I can't get it out. And if I can't get it out, I can't properly deal with it myself as a survivor. As we wrap up, I just want to quickly go around the room. Is there one thing that you think is missing from this conversation, or one question that remains outstanding that you're going to be taking into your future of, you know, research or pondering? And is there one thing that you would like to say as a message to the audience? So now that I've thrown that out there, Amy, I'm going to ask you to answer it first.
I suppose it would probably be fitting for me to emphasize that we need more understanding and context of sibling and family relationships, hence the research that I'm doing. I don't think we can understand abuse and behaviour without a relationship context. I think we're doing the families and research a disservice by not looking to that context.
Thank you, Amy. Peter, going back through the alphabet.
I was hoping you weren't going to come to me next, Nancy. Never very good at answering these questions. I don't know. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I'm not entirely sure who the audience is likely to be for this kind of podcast, but I suppose I would want to maybe just reiterate, I guess, that sibling sexual abuse or sibling sexually abusive behavior, which might be a nicer language. I also appreciate that, actually, and I'm also gonna steal that. Is pretty widespread. It has very profound impacts on children and wider families that I think are every bit as harmful as sexual abuse by, for example, a parent. But there are additional impacts and different impacts, I think, with sibling sexual abuse that make it different and require a different response from abuse such as by parents. Particularly around the guilt and shame that children and adults can experience, the confusion about where responsibility lies for the behaviour, and the impact of the minimizing responses that children and adults typically receive when they try to tell people about their behaviour, and the secrets that they therefore sometimes feel obliged to keep. You know, there's huge parts of people's childhood experiences that they can't share with intimate partners, for fear of the response that they might get, that I think that makes it different from other forms of sexual abuse. So I suppose I would want to kind of stress that, and I suppose also just to again emphasize that that this may involve brothers abusing sisters, but it can also involve brothers abusing brothers, or sisters abusing brothers, or sisters abusing sisters. And from all the research that we have so far, all of these different pairings are equally impactful, and we shouldn't be making assumptions about the seriousness and the impact of those behaviours based on these kind of gender sort of stereotypes.
Thank you for that, Peter. Stuart, last but not least.
I'm aware we need to finish because of the time, but I think a really helpful discussion. Two thoughts. Peter and Amy, here's an invite. I think you guys and myself, and maybe Nancy, I think there's a great paper to be written about use of language in this space, and also who owns language and who has a right to use it. I think that would be really interesting to kind of flesh out. And the last thing I just wanted to reiterate is that this is a difficult subject for people who are affected by it in any way. There is help and support out there, and indeed, Stop It Now, both in the UK and internationally, but loads of other helplines you can contact as well. So please reach out for help if you're affected.
Yeah, and more coming all the time now too, right? With all this going on. So I want to thank you all today for your time. This, we looked at a couple of things deeply, and then we touched on various things. There's lots of scope and range for further conversations, but I think what we covered was really important today. And I really do appreciate your time, your energy around this subject, and of course your expertise as well. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you.